So when we're extending loving kindness, and may you be happy, may you be free of suffering, may I be happy and free of suffering, it's all grounded in that relative level of separate self, of self and other. And this is a reality, and it's probably the prevalent reality of our lives. This relative sense of individuality, of self, with all the particular conditioning, on that level. Another level is, we could call a more ultimate level, where self disappears, and we just see that our actual life experience is the moment-to-moment unfolding of what in Buddhism are called the five aggregates, or you could say just the different elements of mind and body arising and passing very quickly, in which there's no self, there's no other, there's not a reference point of individuality, and we're seeing a more fundamental level of reality. So just as an example of this, if we have a glass for drinking water, on the obvious level of perception, we see the glass, we understand what it is, we use it, we pour water, we drink out of it. If we looked at that glass through a high-power microscope, glass would disappear. The whole level of reality of glass is no longer there, and we're seeing another level. It's exactly in the same way. On the relative level, there's self and other, with everything that's entailed, in that individuality. And on another level, self disappears. So the first point is to realize that both of these levels are operative. It's not that somehow we're able to separate. The relative level is on one side and the ultimate level is on the other. It's the same unified experience seen from different levels, different perspectives. So on the relative level, we move towards diversity and inclusion, and equity is the acknowledgement that on the relative level there are a lot of things going on in our society, in ourselves, in meditation institutions, that for one reason or another, out of social conditioning, may make it an unwelcoming place for either people of color or other marginalized groups, that they may not feel comfortable in coming into, for example, an all-white environment with the dominant cultural qualities or attributes being predominant or characteristic of the environment. So, for example, I've heard very often that, people of color may be coming to a retreat and they are the only one, or maybe one of 2 out of 100.
Right.
So just that experience, that creates, and has created in people, and this is, the report from them, of, one might say, non-relaxation, or some uncertainty based on the lived cultural experience in this country. And so part of the interest, and really what's inspiring us to do some of this work, is to really see the ways in which the institutions and the context of a retreat may be unwelcoming, in ways we're not as dominant culture, may not even be aware of. And then to see if we can create an environment that is inclusive and where people do feel welcome and in a place of ease and relaxation. And so it is addressing some of these issues and trying to create that kind of environment in which people can then settle back more easily into that meditative state of the more ultimate reality, where self and other and race and all other kinds of diverse attributes within all of our operatives, where we are on that more ultimate level and we experience those levels of realization.
I can imagine multiple ways of trying to correct for this, though, and some would run afoul of this questioner's concerns and some wouldn't. So, for instance, I think we could all acknowledge that being the only black person, say, on a 100-person retreat is less than optimal amount of diversity, certainly from the perspective of the person there. But so you could try to recruit more black students in this case, but if you wanted something more representative of society on retreats, but trying for more outreach in these communities, it would be different than, say, having a people of color retreat where only people of color would come to it. That would be a different effort. That second response, at least I'm imagining from the questioner's point of view, would seem to kind of reify the importance of this rather than just behind the scenes recruiting more and more in various communities to make retreats look more and more like society at large. You're now saying, we're going to have a retreat just for lesbians or a retreat just for people of color. That seems to call attention to this variable as having some kind of primacy in a way that on the substance of the question would seem odd or potentially misleading.
Yeah, and that has been a critique, offered for different of these retreats, but the experience of having these retreats, and it could be retreats for people of color or the LGBTIQ community or women's retreats. And the experience of having these retreats has been very valuable because for people who, for one reason or another, do feel marginalized in some way in society, these retreats provide an environment of safety that is welcoming for people, and I've heard this from many people, and in these various diverse groups, women have said that on a women's retreat, there's a level of relaxation and openness that they can experience, and shared understandings that is very valuable and different than a mixed retreat. And it's the same for the people of color retreats. So it's the understanding that, yes, theoretically, on the more ultimate level, these differences are not important. And in fact, they disappear. But on the relative level, they are the lived experiences of people, both on retreat and in the world, and acknowledging that and providing an opportunity for people to come in a situation that feels safe and feels welcoming, often is the doorway for people to enter into the practice, to deepen their practice, and then to find that they feel at ease in mixed retreats, ones that are not specialized. So I just see it as a very valuable entrance point, into the practice. And there's one other point. It's not only about creating a feeling of welcome or inclusivity. It's also the recognition that people from diverse backgrounds bring diverse perspectives on the Dharma, and which aspects of the Dharma really relate to their experience and the way the Dharma teachings are expressed. As we know, just from the history of Buddhism, as the teachings went from one culture to another, from India to China to Japan, the teachings got expressed in very different ways depending on the culture. And so it's not that there's just one fixed way of conveying the teachings.
Right.
And so as we get more diverse populations into the practice, it's actually enriching for the practice. It's not simply creating a welcoming environment. It's actually enriching the whole the whole scene.
Okay, well, I will let that stand. Somehow I think we're not going to satisfy this particular questioner. A question about psychedelics, Joseph. Says a reader of Michael Pollan's recent book. Michael Pollan was recently on this podcast talking about his book on psychedelics. Very good book. It seems I could fast-track years of meditation by just going on a psychedelic mushroom journey. This is the questioner. Does Joseph have thoughts on using psychedelics and how they fit in here? Do psychedelics supersede meditative efforts? There are certainly people who, over the years, have said that really were such hard cases that only the hammer of a high-dose psychedelic experience can crack things open for us. Terence McKenna famously said that he was distrustful of any recommendation beyond, or any recommendation short of a significant dose of psilocybin or DMT or less, to his taste, LSD. And any recommendation that people visit a certain teacher or try a certain yoga practice or breath-based meditation, that this is just not of sufficient firepower to help most people most of the time.
Well, I think that ignores thousands of years of history of people doing various practices and being transformed by them. So I think his position is a bit extreme.
Right. I think his position was that most of these practices were originally done in concert with taking psychedelics, and that when you're on high doses of mushrooms, basically everything seems to work, and meditation makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But when you're not, you're just left alone with your ego.
I don't think that's accurate. So certainly within the Buddhist tradition,
right?
I don't think it started with the psychedelic experience. So that being said, and the history of thousands of years of people practicing without it and being transformed, so the thought that it's a necessary component of the path seems a little off to me. That being said, and both from my own experience back in the day and the experience of many others, a psychedelic experience can open up some different level of understanding in a very, very dramatic way. So a couple of points about that. One is there can be a lot of experiences that happen both with or without psychedelics that people take to be enlightenment and actually are not. They're just some altered reality, a cosmic experience. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier. If it doesn't result in the weakening or uprooting of the defilements of mind, then no matter how altered the experience is, it seems to me of less value or not that ultimately significant. But the real test is in the transformation of mind, not the particular experience that people have. It is possible that people do have some genuine level of realization on a psychedelic experience. But the question then is, then what? And the answer to that question is expressed in teachings by an 11th century Korean Zen master. His name was Chinul. And he framed the path in a way that I find very interesting. He called it sudden awakening, gradual cultivation.
Yeah, that's a great book, by the way, Tracing Back the Radiance.
Yes. Yeah. And so that points to the possibility of having a sudden awakening from whatever means, whether it's with psychedelics, and there's a sudden awakening to a deeper level of reality, or without psychedelics. Just in meditation, we have a sudden awakening. But this one moment of awakening is the beginning, not the end. And it takes a gradual cultivation of that to really integrate the realization in a meaningful way into our lives. And that takes a practice. I don't see psychedelics as being a practice. I see it as being potentially an opening to a certain kind of experience. which might or might not be helpful. But if it is helpful, then it needs to be cultivated in a systematic and methodical way.
Right.
And I think that's the great value and strength of a meditation practice. So we begin to integrate, that particular experience and deepen it.
Yeah, I mean, the piece I would add here is that the crucial insight from meditation, which you almost by definition don't get with psychedelics, is that ordinary conscious experience is just as transcendental, to use a loaded word, or just as selfless, just as free as the most psychedelic transformation of the contents of consciousness. So you don't need any of the pyrotechnics to notice that the ego doesn't exist, right, or that the self is an illusion. And it's hard to see that when your method is just a matter of invoking the pyrotechnics.
Yes. So here we're in rare agreement, Sam.
Yes.
So
it's good to have
I agree completely with that, and it would refer back to what we were talking about earlier, how in some way the fundamental freedom of mind is in the end of craving, is in the mind that's not craving, not clinging. So to use a Josephism, which I've used very often over the years, it doesn't matter to what you don't cling. So you don't have to have a cosmic experience not to cling to. We might as well not cling to this moment's experience. Because it's the not clinging that is the operative word, not the experience itself.
Right. But it is hard to see what is free and unconditioned about ordinary experience. A flip side of this is when you look at the impediment to the range of insights we're talking about here, which is to say, when you look at what keeps ordinary experience truly ordinary in the sense of mediocre, dull, unilluminated by any kind of insight, it is incredibly subtle. It's just being lost in thought. I mean, this is something you spoke about last night. It is genuinely paradoxical that something as insubstantial as a thought, this next thought, whatever it is, however fleeting, has the capacity to seemingly completely submerge consciousness into this sense of, one, dualistic clinging to this sense of self in each moment, but two, it produces whatever the emotional and neurophysiological consequences are of the contents of that thought. So if you have a thought about something that terrifies you or something that humiliates you, it can be the briefest impingement of just a fleeting image or piece of language, or just rehearsing the last phrase in a conversation you had forgotten until now, and it's just borne back to you in all its horrible awkwardness, that suddenly your whole mind is captured by this phantom. So, Joseph, what is a thought? Why is anyone suffering any of this, ever?
I think we are, because we very rarely ask ourselves the question, what is a thought? We're so habituated to being lost in the story of our thoughts, lost in the content of our thoughts, commenting on our being lost or not being lost. And it's very rare that people will actually ask the question, what is a thought? Not for the sake of an intellectual or conceptual answer, but as a device for looking directly at it and seeing, as you said, the essential emptiness and ephemerality of it. So that question itself becomes a very useful meditative tool. When we're having a lot of thoughts, just to ask ourselves the question, well, what is it? And looking directly at it and seeing how empty it is. So just asking that question, what is a thought, really can help break the seduction of the storyline. and we see it as just a passing phenomena, and seeing the contrast between being lost in the thought and seeing it as kind of a bubble in the mind, that contrast is so revealing. The one way of tuning into this, which I found very helpful, again, both in my own practice and with many others, is really watching. We all have the experience of we're in meditative process, and then we get lost in a thought for some time, and at a certain point we wake up, to the fact that we're thinking. Generally, what people will do in that moment of waking up from being lost will hurry back to whatever object of meditation they think they should be on, whether it's a body or breath or sounds, whatever it may be. I found it really helpful in that moment of awakening from being lost to actually take a few moments reflection to experience what it was like to have been lost. And since we've just come out of being lost, it's accessible to us. Right. That's what the mind was like when it was lost. And then in that moment of transition, we can contrast that very clearly with what's the quality or nature of the mind when it's awake. And so that gives us a very clear picture of the nature of the deluded mind and the nature of the awake mind, right in that moment of transition. So it's a powerful moment not to overlook. Another principle that is very hard to remember, but is fundamental to the meditative process, and it's hard to remember even for experienced meditators. We just kind of forget this again and again, that from the perspective of meditation and insight and freedom, what it is that's arising, the particular experience that's arising, is not important. It doesn't matter what's arising. What's important from this perspective is how we're relating to it.
Right.
So that is what the meditative process is about. It's not about trying to control what experiences arise. It's always about what's the relationship to that experience.
Which is the point you just made with this strange mantra, it doesn't matter what you're not clinging to.
Exactly.
Let's linger on this experience of being lost in thought and awakening to that first moment. I mean, my view of this is, whenever I've discussed this, it sounds to Western ears, and certainly to the ears of anyone who's a psychologist or studies the mind scientifically, it sounds strangely uncharitable to say what I'm about to say. For me, this doesn't seem too strong, that being lost in thought is analogous to dreaming and not knowing that you're dreaming when we're asleep. The notion of waking up is almost literally true as far as an analogy. But that also means that it is analogous to a kind of psychosis. It does feel like a mental illness to be continually submerged without knowing it by these, again, the most gossamer and insubstantial and ineffectual appearances in consciousness when recognized. But when not recognized, they are one's all-encompassing reality. It is the absolute paradigm of delusion. You are convinced that something is there which isn't there, that certain things must follow which need not follow. This becomes obvious to everyone once people begin to helplessly vocalize their thoughts, that is, talk to themselves in public. So when you see someone talking to himself in public who doesn't know enough just to shut his mouth, right, that person's insane, right? And we've all been that person very briefly, and that's embarrassing. So you're in public and you suddenly remember something that you forgot, and you say, oh shit, I can't believe you're talking to yourself in front of people, right? So for that brief moment, you're a madman. The difference between you and a madman is the madman just doesn't stop. But we're doing that all day long within the silence of our own minds, within the privacy of our own minds. And when you see the alternative, which is mindfulness, everything else seems insane. Is that putting it too strongly?
No, it's putting it in a Sam-like way, which I haven't, again, we're very much in alignment in all this, and everything you just said could also have been me speaking, so I totally relate to it.
I mean, I'm not saying that people need to be judgmental of this experience.
No.
I'm just saying this to recognize how bizarre it is to be this disconnected
Yes.
by this thing, virtually every moment of the day.
Yeah. So there are just a couple of things I would say. I think I would probably tend to use the word deluded rather than insane, although it seems that people might be more open to seeing it.
But delusion
Is
as a
a kind of
term,
insanity.
it carries a lot of weight within the Buddhist lexicon.
Right.
You're using delusion as a fundamental way of just completely
not
mistaking
not
your
seeing
reality.
what's what.
Yeah.
So just one of my first teacher, Munindra's little sayings, which just illustrates this point. He would often say, "The thought of your mother is not your mother. It's a thought.
Right.
The thought of anything is not the thing. It's a thought." And again, to see that is very liberating. So we're not confusing the two.
We're running out of time here, Joseph, so a few quick questions, quick answers. In Western culture, it appears that one of the biggest challenges for meditators is trying too hard and adopting the same approach one might at the gym to the practice of meditation. The harder I train, the fitter I'll get. What's your perspective on applying the right amount of effort?
Well, the right effort is a key component of the Buddha's teachings, and it's a delicate art. And the example, the classic example given is tuning the strings of a lute. Not too tight, not too loose, in order to get the proper sound. And so it's an ongoing. It takes an ongoing sensitivity and adjusting to really watch when we're striving too hard. And then it's a question of settling back and opening up and letting the mind become more spacious and choiceless. At other times we're becoming too spaced out, where there's not enough effort, and that time collecting the attention in some way will serve to bring about balance. So this adjustment, is an ongoing part of the path. We need to be cognizant of the quality of our effort at any particular time. So that being said, it's also interesting, there's a teaching which describes 4 paths to success. Success here in terms of deepening insight and realization. And it really depends, the paths depend on different personality configurations. So one of the paths to success is effort, and so there are some people who are inspired by and challenged by difficult tasks, and it arouses that quality of, we might say, enlightenment or bust, and it's the making of the effort that is energizing and inspiring to them. It does need to be done in balance, but as a quality, as a driving quality in the mind, it can be a vehicle for realization. For other people, it's more investigation rather than effort. So it's not that the challenge of a difficult task inspires tremendous effort to do it. For another kind of person, it's just interest in how the mind is working and understanding the mind. So that becomes their path to success. And there are concentration can become a path to success. That becomes the vehicle. So for different people, different personality types, there will be different emphases in what actually moves us forward.
Right. What is the biggest misconception about Buddhism or about meditation?
Well, I think the biggest misconception perhaps about Buddhism is that it's all about suffering. Because in terms of the Four Noble Truths, which are the foundational teachings of the Buddha, it's often translated as the truth of suffering and the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the path leading to the end of suffering. And suffering seems to be, in bright lights. But that word, this suffering, is not a good translation of the Pali word dukkha, which is often translated as suffering. But it's not, in many cases, not so useful, because there's a lot of situations in our lives that are not suffering, that are pleasurable and enjoyable, and that we would not call this is suffering.
Mhm.
So when the Buddha is talking about the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, he's talking about a characteristic of all experience, all conditioned experience, as being unreliable because of their impermanence. So that can be applied equally well to painful situations or pleasant situations. They're all unreliable and therefore not worth pointing to. So I think that is one of the fundamental misconceptions about Buddhism.
I don't know if we want to answer this question. I'll pitch it to you. You decide. There's a question about transcendental meditation and how it differs from mindfulness meditation. I've said some somewhat disparaging things about TM in the past, really just about the seemingly kind of mercenary nature of the organization, not about the mantra-based technique. But do you have obviously many people do TM and seem to get a great benefit from it. How do you view the technique of TM in light of what you're up to in the mindfulness game?
There's a basic distinction between two broad streams of meditation practice, which crosses all traditions. Whether Buddhist or Hindu or any other. There are the techniques which focus on the development of concentration and one-pointedness. And there are many techniques for doing this. It could be mantra, it could be visualization, it could be a sound, where we take a single object and train the mind to stay steady on it. And this develops the capacity of one-pointedness in the mind, which can become very deep, very strong, very powerful. The other stream of meditation we might call insight practices as opposed to concentration practices, where the main focus is on refining the perception of change and impermanence and selflessness, where insight is the primary emphasis rather than one-pointedness. Now these two are not in conflict, because the stronger concentration we have, the easier it is to develop insight, because the mind is not so scattered, not so frequently lost. But in and of themselves, they're two different techniques with different purposes.
Another question here. Saying the phrase consciousness and its content seems to invite a duality and to reify consciousness as a thing that one is. Can you clarify this so as to avoid making this mistake? This is a phrase I use a lot, consciousness and its contents. I'll give my 2 cents and then get yours. Consciousness is this knowing quality of mind. It's the fact of consciousness is the fact that it's like something to be us, whatever our circumstance is, whatever reality actually is, and however we may or may not understand it. The fact of consciousness, whether this is a simulation, whether we're a brain in a vat, whether this is just a dream, the fact of consciousness is utterly established by anything seeming to happen, whatever the status of that seeming actually is. So to be confused is also to be conscious. To think that you know what reality is and be wrong about it is to be conscious. Consciousness is not predicated on being right about anything. It's just predicated on the lights being on in any way at all. And one can clearly differentiate the consciousness from its contents in the sense that consciousness is the space in which everything's appearing, and whatever is appearing is the contents. So thoughts and emotions and sensations, these are all things we can describe, and one can say something is present or absent based on particularizing the contents of consciousness. But the duality collapses when you recognize that the contents are, in some basic sense, made of consciousness. I mean, there's a medium. This is kind of reifying language, but there's a medium or a context that gets modified, or apparently modified, by the way, in our case, the way our nervous system sections up reality. So we have kinds of perceptions and sensations and mental objects and apparent changes, but all of which, when consciousness is recognized to be without self or without center, all of which has the character of seeming to modify a medium that they're inseparable from. So the usual analogies seem apt. We talk about the way things can appear in a mirror, right? When you recognize a mirror as a mirror, all of the light and the color and the shadow in the mirror is of a piece with the reflective properties of the mirror itself. Or the analogy that many people often use is a film. You're watching a display of light and color and shadow on a wall, right? The film is everything that seems to be happening. You know, a fire appears to be burning a building, but all of it is made of light. Everything has the exact same status as being within the medium of what is being broadcast there, which is light. So these kinds of insights into the openness and the intrinsic freedom of consciousness, the claim that is often made that consciousness in some sense transcends its content. It does. It's the prior condition of anything that's appearing, but anything that does in fact appear is also of a piece with whatever consciousness is in itself. So there's no ultimate division between consciousness and object, and to maintain such a division is to impose a kind of conceptual framework on there which can be seen through and lost when you're paying close enough attention. Anyway, that's the way I would think about it. And for the one person I didn't confuse by that answer, my congratulations to you.
I do want to offer a simpler description. So I think it addresses this question, but we'll see. And that is realizing that two things can be distinguishable but inseparable. And so, for example, we look at some object, and it could be anything. Now I'm looking at a flashlight on the desk, and so I'm looking at this black flashlight, and there's a color to it and a form. And those two aspects are distinguishable. The color is not form, and the form is not color, and yet you can't separate them. The color is in a form, and the form has color. And I think that same analogy in terms of knowing an object, they are distinguishable aspects. So as you said, consciousness is the capacity of knowing, the capacity of awareness, as you said, the lights on aspect of the mind. That can be distinguished from the particular content arising in consciousness, and yet it's inseparable from it. And so I think that addresses the problem of being with these two aspects in a non-dual way. Because we see their inseparability, but that doesn't mean that everything just mushes together and is indistinguishable.
Right. One question about the quality of mindfulness. Does mindfulness, in terms of its power, exist along a spectrum, or are we simply talking about more identical moments of mindfulness? How do you think about mindfulness growing in its power or capacity?
I think there are two ways of looking at that. One is in just the increased continuity of moments of mindfulness. So I have a phrase which I use sometimes. I call them NPMs, which are noticings per minute. And so in the beginning of practice, maybe there are 10 NPMs, but with practice, that number goes way up. So for example, in the beginning, we might be aware of an in-breath and an out-breath. With practice, we see that within the in-breath, there are myriad different sensations. Hundreds, maybe thousands of different sensations that may be going on within an in-breath. And so the NPMs, the noticings per minute, as mindfulness deepens, goes way up. So that's one way of understanding the deepening or strengthening of that faculty. The other way has to do with, you might say, the level of focus or the level of clarity in a moment of mindfulness. There's a state that's very common among meditators, and we see it often on retreat. I call it times when we're more or less mindful. We're kind of there, we're kind of present, we're not totally lost in our thoughts, but we're not fully there, we're not fully embodied. And so that's another refinement of what mindfulness means, where we go from that kind of being present to being completely present.
A related question here, is there a very wide range of talent with respect to mindfulness? Are there people who take up the practice of meditation and are instantly good at it, successful, and don't encounter the usual range of frustrations and seemingly hard-won progress? Are there people who just are prodigies of meditation?
There are. I would say they're not the majority. But the Buddha described 4 ways of making progress on the path. He described slow progress with a lot of pain, slow progress with a lot of ease, quick progress with a lot of pain, quick progress with a lot of ease.
Right.
And all of this is conditioned within the Buddhist context of understanding by one's past karma. What we've developed, and again within the Buddhist framework, which in this particular domain may not appeal to many of your listeners, but the whole idea of rebirth, in many lives. So within the Buddhist teaching, we come into this life already with different propensities, different things that have been developed. And so some people come in already, or even if one doesn't subscribe to past lives or future lives, even within this one lifetime, some people have developed strong concentration through one means or another.
Moving on to this next question, with respect to rebirth, karma, and all the rest of the metaphysics of Buddhism, do you think that there is a totally secular, rational, non-otherworldly version of all of those ideas that can be justified and motivating within the context of this life? I mean, there's a version of thinking about karma and rebirth within the context of any life, or even within the context of a single minute or hour?
Yeah, I think there is in 2 different ways. So one of the ways that it's often been interpreted in the West, for people who don't necessarily have this, the Buddhist metaphysical background, rebirth is sometimes described as rebirth in different realms depending on our mind states. Like if we're consumed with hatred, it's a hell realm.
Right.
If the mind is filled with kindness and compassion, it's a heaven realm. And so just seeing that we're taking rebirth moment to moment in different realms according to what mind state is arising, and develops. So that's one way of understanding rebirth. That's actually in this life, moment to moment. Another way of understanding that is one that I really am coming to appreciate more and more. Karma as the unfolding of karma within this lifetime. I'm seeing and appreciating increasingly as just being the effect of our mind states and actions on our own minds. In other words, we could think of consciousness as being the inner environment in which we live and operate. What are we doing? How are we influencing this environment? Are we polluting it? Are we purifying it? And so we can understand the immediate effect of karma, whether something leads to happiness or suffering, right in terms of what is the effect of this particular mind state on my own mind. If I'm, as I said a little earlier, if I'm filled with anger or hatred or lust or whatever, the immediate karmic result of that is some kind of contraction, tension, suffering. and we have wholesome mind states, the immediate karmic effect is one of greater ease and greater spaciousness. So the karmic effect can be understood very pragmatically in the moment by watching the effect on our own minds.
Yeah, and also that there are further ramifications of that, obviously, just in terms of what you say to others, how you treat them, how they treat you in return. So you can see that just play out over the course of moments and minutes in your life. Okay, a final question, Joseph, because we are unfortunately out of time. Can you help me with my struggle to understand the concept of non-inherent existence in Buddhism? The idea that this is a Nagarjuna quote, or purports to be, quote, understanding the non-inherent existence of things means seeing the reality, i.e. emptiness, which eliminates ignorance about the reality of things, end quote. What is emptiness, Joseph?
So one of the meanings of that term, emptiness, which is a classic Buddhist term, which is not immediately obvious in the English rendition of emptiness, means that nothing has an inherent self-existence because everything is dependently arising. Things arise out of causes and conditions. And so it's not that something exists independent of conditions. It arises because of them. And so that's the essential emptiness of the phenomenon. So just as an example, just take the phenomena of a rainbow. You go outside after a storm and you see this beautiful rainbow in the sky, and we usually have delight and joy in seeing it. But the rainbow is not a thing in itself. A rainbow is an appearance arising from the conjunction of certain conditions of air and moisture and light, and these conditions come together, rainbow appears. When we understand that there's no thing called rainbow, that rainbow is simply an appearance arising out of these conditions coming together, so then we're beginning to see that rainbow does not have some self-existent nature.
Right.
It's contingent upon, or an appearance dependent upon, the conditions. And this is true of all our experience. So there's nothing at the core of things.
Well, there's this added fact that the things that we perceive as things, for the most part, perhaps without exception, tend to be conceptually designated upon their parts in a way that is susceptible to analysis. So you take something, this works for a rainbow, but it works better for something like a car. You think of a car as a thing, but then you can ask yourself, well, what is a car without doors, and without wheels, and without a hood, and without window glass? And when does it cease to be a car? You see that this notion of a car is an aggregate of car parts. There's no carness intrinsic to any of the parts. There's no carness within the door, or within the wheel, or within the axle. But you get them all together, and we have a quote car. But it is a conceptual designation on relationships, and every complex thing that we talk about is that, whether it's a school or a democracy or a person, and things that are truly simple, we're rarely dealing with. I mean, even when we're talking about atoms, we're not talking about something that isn't built upon relationships. All of that sounds quite abstract and philosophical and uninformative for someone's lived experience. For me, the notion of emptiness links back very directly and experientially to what we were talking about earlier about the nature of consciousness and the differentiation between consciousness and its contents. So that when you're looking at objects in your field of view, in visual consciousness, it's very easy to fixate on them as objects. There's a pen over there, there's a book, there's a flashlight, there's a phone. Those are all different. I can see all of them. They're all objects. But my visual field is appearing in and as consciousness. And so all of those objects are very much like objects that I've seen in a mirror, where they're only kind of nominally and conceptually designated upon a field of light and color, which is not a pen or a book or a phone or a flashlight. And in some sense, conscious experience very much has that character where you can just see an expanse of your visual field, and the perception of objects is an additional operation within that space. And in many cases, it can be mistaken. You think you've seen something and you actually haven't, and that transition is often illuminating, because then you just see that your experience is made of the concept more than it's made of the actual valid perception of the thing there.
I just want to make an attempt to perhaps offer a simpler explanation.
Something less confounding.
For my poor old brain. I think a lot what you just described can be experienced very directly when we see the difference between, for example, when we're mindful of the bare experience of seeing, and then the thought process which gives a name or a designation to it. And so we say conventionally, I see the flashlight. But actually, the eye does not see flashlight. The eye sees color and form and however the rods and cones work in the eye. And then the mind thinks flashlight and overlays the concept on top of it.
Although, in defense of seeing objects, seeing a flashlight isn't contingent upon saying the word flashlight to oneself. I mean, the concept is harder to get a hold of than that. It's less conscious than that. I mean,
but
we often do gratuitously name things that we see as well to ourselves, but
no, I know the recognition can be very immediate, and without that